Greetings in the name and grace and peace of Jesus, our living Lord. Welcome to Good Friday worship at Grace United Methodist Church. I'm the Reverend Dr. Nanette Roberts, and it is my humble pleasure to welcome you to one of the worship services that is perhaps most difficult for the community of faith as we face into the death of our Messiah with the promise of resurrection. Blessed be the name of the Lord our God, who redeems us from sin and death. For us and for our salvation, Christ became obedient, even to death on a cross. Blessed be the name of the Lord. And hear this blessing from Jan Richardson. You will know this blessing by how it does not stay still, by the way it refuses to rest in one place. You will recognize it by how it takes first one form, then another, now running down the face of his mother, who watches the breaking of the child she had borne so many years before, now in the stance of the woman who followed him here and will not leave him bereft. Now it twists in anguish on the mouth of the friend whom he loved. Now it bears itself in the wound and the cry, the finishing, the final breath, and the yielding. This blessing is not in any one of these alone. It is what binds them together. It is what dwells in the space between them. Though it be torn and gaping, it is what abides in the tear that the rending makes. Let us worship together.
O sacred head, now wounded, with grief and shame weighed down, now scornfully surrounded with thorns, thine only crown. How pale thou art with anguish, with sore abuse and scorn. How does that visage languish, which once was bright as morn? What thou, my Lord, hast suffered was all for sinners' gain. Mine was the transgression, but thine the deadly pain. Lo, here I fall, my Savior, 'tis I deserve thy place. Look on me with thy favor, vouchsafe to me thy grace. What language shall I borrow to thank thee, dearest friend, for this thy dying sorrow, thy pity without end? Oh, make me thine forever, and should I fainting be, Lord, let me never, never outlive my love to thee.
Join me in prayer. God of mystery and wonder, because we know the ending of the story, it's tempting for us to ignore the darkness of this day, to go about our business as usual and to move quickly to the joy of Easter morning. But give us courage and strength on this day to live for a while in the darkness, to set aside our own need for comfort and for control, to feel the darkness into which Jesus entered, and the darkness that so many people in the world experience. Because for most of us, this journey through Holy Week is a journey of discovery in an unfamiliar world. We attempt to some degree to experience what those on the margins, those with severe disabilities or illness, the migrant, the refugee, the homeless, the poor, the jobless, the voiceless, the powerless, victims of violence, those with mental illness, all experience as their normality. Uncertainty, fear, even darkness. As we remembering the suffering of Christ, make us mindful of suffering throughout the world. And as we remember the death of Christ, bring us back to the beginning of Lent, to Ash Wednesday, and to the awareness of our mortality and the mortality of those we love. And then, God of grace, remind us that life does not end with death. We trust that we too will be raised to new life in this world, here and now, and in the mystery of what lies beyond physical death. We trust that the whole world will be born anew, that your kingdom is coming, a new heaven and a new earth. On this day of darkness, it is for this kingdom that we boldly pray. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory forever. Amen.
Tenebrae is an ancient service. It's a prolonged meditation on Christ's suffering and his death. These readings will trace the story of Christ's passion. Music will portray his pathos. The power of silence and darkness suggests the intensity on this most momentous day. As the flames are extinguished of these 12 candles, we ponder the depth of Christ's suffering and death, and we remember the cataclysmic nature of his sacrifice. Through the remaining flame of the Christ candle at the conclusion of the service, we anticipate the promise being fulfilled, even that of eternal life, but not yet. Hear this first reading, the 22nd chapter of Luke, verses 41 through 46. Then Jesus withdrew from them about a stone's throw and knelt down and prayed, Father, if you are willing, remove this cup from me, yet not my will, but yours be done. Then an angel from heaven appeared to him and gave him strength, and in his anguish he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat became like great drops of blood falling down on the ground. When he got up from prayer, he came to the disciples and found them sleeping because of grief. And he said to them, Why are you sleeping? Get up and pray that you may not come into the time of trial.
I stand amazed in the presence of Jesus the Nazarene, and wonder how he could love me, a sinner condemned unclean.
For me he knelt in the garden and prayed, not my will but thine. He had no tears for his own griefs, but sweat drops of blood for mine.
Oh, how marvelous, oh, how wonderful, and my song shall ever be. Oh, how
chapter 22, verses 66 through 71. When day came, the assembly of the elders of the people, both chief priests and scribes, gathered together, and they brought him to their council. They said, "If you are the Messiah, tell us." He replied, "If I tell you, you will not believe, and if I question, you will not answer. But from now on, the Son of Man will be seated at the right hand of the power of God." All of them asked, "Are you then the Son of God?" He said to them, "You say that I am." Then they said, "What further testimony do we need? We have heard it ourselves from his own lips." Words from Luke chapter 23, verses 1 through 7. Then the assembly rose as a body and brought Jesus before Pilate. They began to accuse him, saying, "We found this man perverting our nation, forbidding us to pay taxes to the emperor, and saying that he himself is the Messiah, a king." Then Pilate asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" He answered, "You say so." Then Pilate said to the chief priests and the crowds, "I find no basis for an accusation against this man." But they were insistent and said, "He stirs up the people by teaching throughout all Judea, from Galilee where he began, even to this place." When Pilate heard this, he asked whether the man was a Galilean. And when he learned that he was under Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him off to Herod, who was himself in Jerusalem at that time.
Precious blood, love sacrifice. From a grateful heart we honor Christ. From a grateful heart we honor Christ. Should we gaze upon his cross? Should we feel his pain, his loss? May we know the bitter price and take our cross to honor Christ. His nail-pierced hands, his wounded side, the Lamb so pure was crucified. His precious blood, love sacrifice. From a grateful heart we honor Christ. From a grateful heart we honor Christ.
A reading from Luke 23, verses 8 through 12. When Herod saw Jesus, he was very glad, for he had been wanting to see him for a long time, because he had heard about Jesus and was hoping to see Jesus perform some sign. He questioned Jesus at some length, but Jesus gave him no answer. The chief priests and the scribes stood by, vehemently accusing him. Even Herod with his soldiers treated him with contempt and mocked him. Then he put an elegant robe on Jesus and sent him back to Pilate. That same day, Herod and Pilate became friends with each other. Before this, they had been enemies. I imagine that he must have been disappointed. In the midst of the festival and all that was going on, with the sound of celebration and anticipation building all around, after the journey to Jerusalem, in the midst of the excitement that was building, all of a sudden there was something unexpected. Might seem a little bit unreasonable to think about it that way, him being disappointed. Herod, I mean. Maybe it's too much to think that he'd even be bothered enough to get excited enough that he could be let down enough to call it disappointment. With so much power in his hands, with all the people that followed him that did what he said, there within his grasp he had so much. But I guess some might say the same about us. Do we have the right to be disappointed? We have a lot. Is it unreasonable for us to feel let down? Now, I don't think this was the first time that he was disappointed. This was Herod Antipas. He was the youngest son of Herod the Great. You know how hard it can be to be the youngest son. He had watched his older brothers fight and plot with one another. He'd seen 3 of them be executed. Then for a time the throne was to be his and all his, until it wasn't, until it was split between him and 3 others, and he was left just with two areas of control, and not especially significant ones. He had had marriages fall apart. He'd had John the Baptist preaching against him. Maybe he knew what it was to be disappointed. But still, all that power, a great amount of wealth. He had turned a graveyard into a bustling metropolis. He'd created a hub in the world. And yet with all of that, there was apparently still something that he'd been looking forward to. And while he was down in Jerusalem from Tiberias visiting the festival, he'd stumbled upon it almost, you might say, by accident. Here was this Jesus that he'd heard so much about. And the reading suggests that at some very basic, some very human level, Herod was hopeful, perhaps even excited when Jesus, even under these unusual circumstances, showed up on his steps. He was glad, the scripture says. I imagine that Herod was excited to meet the man behind the myth. He was anxious to see him perform some sign. He was eager to know if it was all true. But Jesus didn't say anything. What's that about, Jesus? Aren't you the one who's been talking about things? Everybody's saying what you've said. I've heard you've gone from place to place to place teaching and talking. I've heard about what you've instigated and all of the different things that you've been saying. Jesus comes to this point, though, and he says absolutely nothing. Silence. And Jesus does nothing. What's that about, Jesus? Is not this the man who has given sight to the blind? Is not this the one who cured the woman who had year after year spent all of her money trying to heal the issue of bleeding? Isn't this the same one that they say fed a whole mountainside of people with hardly anything? There's even a rumor going around that he had walked on the water. But here, today, this couldn't be the same guy. This couldn't be the one that Herod had heard about. Because he was exhausted and ragged. And in his eyes there was a look as if he was peering at something in the distance. This couldn't be the same guy because he was beaten and bloodied. There was a lump in his throat. He looked detached from reality. Stilled and silenced. This was Jesus deflated. Compare that to all of the men behind him who are shouting and accusing and shaking their fists. If we pause for longer than one sentence, if we rest here, I think, for a moment, that perhaps more than anything, we might find that on that day Herod was let down. This man couldn't be a king and certainly not a god. The rumors and the fan fiction were nothing more than that. And there with Jesus in front of him, he must have been disappointed. And aren't we? Aren't we sometimes disappointed? With God, I mean. Don't we sometimes feel let down? We live in a chaotic world. From the outside, many of us might seem to think that we have it going on, or we might project that we've got it going on, that we've got everything together. We put a lot of energy into sending that image out into the world. But we know disappointment, and we know frustration, and we know unexpected changes of plan. We know unfulfilled expectations. We know loss, and we know grief. My God, have we experienced that every single day over and over and over again for the last year. We also know fervent prayers, lifelines thrown up to the sky, begging and pleading for some miraculous intervention, some change of course, a different result, some moment of good news. Maybe we also know what it is for God to feel distant, detached from the moment at hand, too deflated to overcome the obstacle. Maybe we know what it's like to be disappointed. Perhaps like Herod, we don't yet understand God. He was waiting for Jesus to perform some sign, looking for a magic trick, expecting to find out just how majestic and regal and commanding he was. And sometimes we just want the same. We want Jesus to jump, perform some sort of miracle, do a magic trick. We've heard that sometimes Jesus does it. Why not now? And friends, maybe in our disappointment, we're missing our purpose. We've forgotten who serves who. We forgot what power and glory look like in this upside-down kingdom that Jesus is proclaiming. Maybe we're looking for entertainment in our lives, and God's looking for rearrangement in our lives. Friends, maybe in our disappointment, we're missing the promise. Not that in the time of trial and difficulty, Jesus will magically and instantly make all things right. Not that we'll always receive a sign, not that the pain will go away or justice will be served right now. Maybe in our disappointment, we're missing the possibility. Not that all will be fixed, but instead the possibility that right there in the midst of it, in the midst of the brokenness and the hurt, when life leaves us exhausted and ragged, beaten and bloodied, stilled and silenced, that right there, Jesus is with us right in the midst of the disappointment. Can that be enough?
Reading from the 23rd chapter of Luke. These are verses 13 through 16. Pilate then called together the chief priests, the leaders, and the people, and said to them, "You brought me this man as one who is perverting the people, and here I have examined him in your presence and have not found this man guilty of any of your charges against him. Neither has Herod, for he sent him back to us. Indeed, he has done nothing to deserve death. I will therefore have him flogged and release him." Luke 18 through 25. Then they all shouted out together, "Away with this fellow! Release Barabbas for us." This was a man who had been put in prison for insurrection that had taken place in the city and for murder. Pilate, wanting to release Jesus, addressed them again, but they kept shouting, "Crucify! Crucify him!" A third time he said to them, "Why? What evil has he done? I have found in him no ground for the sentence of death. I will therefore have him flogged and then release him." But they kept urgently demanding with loud shouts that he should be crucified, and their voices prevailed. So Pilate gave his verdict that their demand should be granted. He released the man they asked for, the one who had been put in prison for insurrection and murder, and he handed Jesus over as they wished.
Alas, and did my Savior bleed, and did my Savior die? Would he devote that sacred head for sinners such as I? At the cross where I first saw the light, and the burden of my heart rolled away. It was there by faith I received my sight, and now I am happy all the day. Well might the sun in darkness hide, and shut his glories in, when Christ the mighty Maker died for man, the creature's sin. What drops of grief can ne'er repay the debt of love I owe? Here, Lord, I give myself away. 'Tis all that I can do. At the cross where I first saw the light, and the burden of my heart rolled away. It was there by faith I received my sight, and now I am happy all the day. At the cross.
A reading from Luke chapter 23, verses 26 through 31. As they led him away, they seized a man, Simon of Cyrene, who was coming from the country, and they laid the cross on him and made him carry it behind Jesus. A great number of the people followed him, and among them were women who were beating their breasts and wailing for him. But Jesus turned to them and said, "Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children. For the days are surely coming when they will say, 'Blessed are the barren in the wombs that never bore, and the breasts that never nursed.' Then they will begin to say to the mountains, 'Fall on us,' and to the hills, 'Cover us.' For if they do this when the wood is green, what will happen when it is dry?" Verses 32 through 38. 2 others also, who were criminals, were led away to be put to death with him. When they came to the place that is called the Skull, they crucified Jesus there with the criminals, one on his right and one on his left. Then Jesus said, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." And they cast lots to divide his clothing. And the people stood by watching. But the leaders scoffed at him, saying, "He saved others. Let him save himself if he is the Messiah of God, his chosen one." The soldiers also mocked him, coming up and offering him sour wine and saying, "If you are the king of the Jews, then save yourself." There was also an inscription over him, "This is the King of the Jews."
Meekness and majesty, manhood and deity, in perfect harmony, the man who is God, Lord of eternity, dwells in humanity, kneels in humility, and washes our feet. Oh, what a mystery, meekness and majesty. Bow down and worship, for this is your God. This is your God. This is your God. Father's pure radiance, perfect in innocence, yet learns obedience to death on a cross. Suffering to give us life, conquering through sacrifice, and as they crucify, praise, Father, forgive. Oh, what a mystery, meekness and majesty. Bow down and worship, for this is your God. This is your God. This is your God. Wisdom unsearchable, God the invisible, love indestructible, in frailty appears. Lord of infinity, stooping so tenderly, lifts our humanity to the heights of his throne. Oh, what a mystery, meekness and majesty. Bow down and worship, for this is your God. This is your God.
Reading from Luke chapter 23, verses 39 to 43. One of the criminals who were hanged there kept deriding him and saying, "Are you not the Messiah? Save yourself and us." But the other rebuked him, saying, Do you not fear God, since you are under the same sentence of condemnation? And we indeed have been condemned justly, for we are getting what we deserve for our deeds. But this man has done nothing wrong." Then he said, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." He replied, "Truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise." It is a rather odd request when you think about it. Remember me when you come into your kingdom. After all, hanging there on the cross, there is no indication that Jesus knew either of the men crucified with him, one on his right and one on his left. Luke uses the Greek word meaning criminals or evildoers to describe the men, while some of the other Gospels refer to them as bandits or thieves. But other than their misdeeds, and now this excruciating, humiliating punishment, what was Jesus to recall, recollect, keep in memory, remember about him? Remember me when you come into your kingdom. Nor is there any indication that either of them had any idea who Jesus was, or had ever heard him preach or teach or witness a miracle. Their only knowledge of Jesus, it seems, was gleaned at the place called the Skull as they were being crucified. There they saw the soldiers cast lots to divide his clothing, while the people stood by, some watching, others weeping. There they heard the leaders scoffing, "He saved others, let him save himself if he is the Messiah of God, God's chosen one." The soldiers too mocked him, saying, "If you are the king of the Jews, save yourself," as they offered him sour wine. And perhaps if they wrenched their necks around, they also saw the sign above Jesus' head inscribed, "This is the King of the Jews." We often refer to these two as the bad thief and the good thief. The bad thief, despite their shared and desperate plights, scornfully joins in with the mockery of the crowd. "Are you not the Messiah? Save yourself and us." Luke tells us he kept deriding or blaspheming Jesus. The one we call good, in contrast, first rebukes the other thief. "Do you not fear God? We are receiving the due rewards of our deeds, but this man has done nothing wrong." And then, turning his neck and looking towards Jesus, he makes his odd request. Not "help me," or "save me," or "deliver me," or "forgive me," all of which would have made sense, but simply, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." And Jesus responds, "Today you will be with me in paradise." This thief is often held up and called good because of his faith, though as we noted, there is no indication that he had ever heard Jesus teach or preach or witnessed a miracle. Perhaps he overheard Jesus' prayer, his first word from the cross, "Father, forgive them," and was impressed by Jesus' quiet grace in spite of the abuse and the suffering he was enduring. Or perhaps the first thief felt pity and wanted to comfort Jesus because of the mockery of the crowd and the railings of the other thief. According to Dorothy Sayers, she suggests this in her play, The Man for All Seasons. According to Sayers, the good thief turned toward Jesus. He turned towards the light, but he did not believe in the light. His words were not so much an act of faith as an act of charity. Yet regardless of a little faith, or a faith mixed with a lot of doubt, whether with understanding or as a half-remembered hope of a promised king who would and could redeem his people, prayed as an act of faith or as an act of charity, which after all also means love, Jesus here takes what he can get, a grain of faith, a half-remembered hope, a small act of kindness, and he gives immeasurably more than he receives. In the end, he remembers the thief whose body was being horribly torn apart, dismembered on the cross. He remembers the thief who in life and now death, in shame and condemnation, has been cut off, dismembered from any kind of society or community. He remembers him saying, "Today you will be with me in paradise." And he still does remember as we stand before the cross or hang on the crosses of our own making. He remembers us looking toward him with our mix of faith and doubt, our desperate half-remembered hopes, even our bitter disappointments and railings. And through that remembering, we, like the thief, are pulled into paradise with Jesus today. Or as theologian Stanley Hauerwas puts it, we are pulled into God's life, into God's body, by the love made manifest on the cross. So then, so that we, like the thief on the cross, can live with the hope and confidence that the only remembering that matters is to be remembered by Jesus. Jesus, remember me, remember us when you come into your kingdom.
Luke chapter 23, verses 44 through 49. It was now about noon, and darkness came over the whole land until 3 p.m, while the sun's light failed, and the curtain of the temple was torn in two. Then Jesus, crying with a loud voice, said, "Father, into your hands I commend my spirit." Having said this, he breathed his last. When the centurion saw what had taken place, he praised God and said, "Certainly this man was innocent." And when all the crowds who had gathered there for the spectacle saw what had taken place, they returned home, beating their breasts. But all his acquaintances, including the women who had followed him from Galilee, stood at a distance, watching these things.
How deep the Father's love for us, how vast beyond all measure, that he should give his only Son to make a wretch his treasure. How great the pain of searing loss, the Father turns his face away, as wounds which mar the chosen one bring many sons to glory. Behold the man upon a cross, my sin upon his shoulders. Ashamed, I hear my mocking voice call out among the scoffers. It was my sin that held him there until it was accomplished. His dying breath has brought me life. I know that it is finished. wounds have paid my ransom. His wounds have paid my ransom.
It's hard for my lantern to light up the kind of darkness that I feel. He's dead, you know. None of us expected it. They said that he was the light that had come into the world and that darkness would not overcome it, even the darkness of the world. But now he's been taken to a tomb, and a stone has been rolled across it, so it's really just dark there and here. They said I had demons. 7 of them. They wrestled around inside me. They said that I wasn't able to keep boundaries, that I couldn't be held accountable, that I was a harlot. They shunned me. No one called me Mary Magdalene. They called me other names. But then he came. I suppose he saw the demons too, wrestling inside of me. Maybe he saw my bitterness and my resentment that no one would ever accept me. But he saw something more. Others said that he wrestled with those demons and that he won. He sort of told me that he simply stood beside me while I wrestled them and confronted them. I think it was his love, the kind of love he had for everyone. And for everyone, there was the possibility of healing. That kind of love, I don't think it can come again. And without that love, where does that leave us? He cried out to God. I cried out to God. It didn't matter. The voices that cried out, "Crucify," at the beginning of the week were crying out, "Hosanna," believing that he would save them. The Roman Empire is oppressive. If you think someone's a savior, then you expect them to overturn all the bad things that make your life hard. And it became clear that he wasn't going to change the way he'd always been, and the way he'd always been was not violent. Not the kind of violence of the Roman Empire. So when it became clear he wasn't going to do what they wanted to do, they started yelling for him to be crucified, to let some other criminal go, and for him to be crucified. And so they did, and the nails were driven in his hands, and nearly everybody who followed him, they scattered and fled, except for John and his mom and some of the rest of us women. I tried to raise my voice, but no one listened. "He's not guilty," I said. "He's not guilty. He healed me. He invited me. Maybe that's why he's being crucified. Maybe it's my fault." I kept thinking, I think we all kept thinking that somehow God would come and at the last minute would free him. And they gave him sour wine. They pierced his side with a spear. You know, that's an act of compassion, really, because it means you die faster. Even he said, "God, why have you forsaken me?" And we wondered too, and I still wonder that. And then it was over. Darkness overwhelmed us from noon to 3. And then everybody just kind of left. But I couldn't. I watched as Joseph of Arimathea, is a very rich man, and Nicodemus, who had been a Pharisee, I don't know if he still is or not, they came and got his body. So Joseph lent Jesus a tomb. So just like he was sort of born in a borrowed stable, He died and was placed in a borrowed tomb. I don't know what I'm going to do. Do you?
Reading from the 53rd chapter of Isaiah, these are verses 3 through 5. He was despised and rejected by others, a man of suffering and acquainted with infirmity, and as one from whom others hid their faces. He was despised, and we held him of no account. Surely he has borne our infirmities and carried our diseases. Yet we accounted him stricken, struck down by God, and afflicted. But he was wounded for our transgressions, crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the punishment that made us whole, and by his bruises we are healed. Verses 7 through 9. He was oppressed, and he was afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth, like a lamb that is led to the slaughter, and like a sheep that before its shearers is silent. So he did not open his mouth. By a perversion of justice he was taken away. Who could have imagined his future? For he was cut off from the land of the living, stricken for the transgressions of my people. They made his grave with the wicked and his tomb with the rich, although he had done no violence, and there was no deceit in his mouth.
Were you there when they crucified my Lord? Were you there when they crucified my Lord? Sometimes it causes me to tremble, tremble, tremble. Were you there when they crucified my Lord? Were you there when they nailed him to the tree? Were you there when they nailed him to whose